The narrative they sold you about Libya is a lie, a devastatingly effective piece of fiction crafted to justify the complete and utter obliteration of a nation. Think about this. How does the most developed country in all of Africa, a nation boasting the highest human development index on the continent, a place with free healthcare, free education, and virtually no national debt, transform into a shattered, war-torn, failed state with open-air slave markets in less than a single year? How does that happen? And why was its leader, a man who just years earlier was shaking hands with Western presidents and prime ministers, suddenly rebranded as a genocidal monster who had to be eliminated at all costs? The answers you were given are a smokescreen. The real reasons are darker, more cynical, and far more disturbing than the simple, digestible tale of a brutal dictator and a noble humanitarian intervention. This was never about saving civilians. This is a story about money, about oil, and about the terrifying price of daring to challenge the global financial order. Over the next few minutes, we will peel back the layers of this deception. We will expose the uncomfortable truths and the geopolitical motives that were deliberately scrubbed from the official record. To understand why Libya had to be destroyed, you must be willing to look beyond the frantic 24-hour news cycle and the solemn political speeches. You have to see the meticulously constructed facade for what it truly is, a mask designed to hide the cold-blooded execution of a sovereign nation for the crime of seeking economic independence. What you are about to learn isn't just a hidden history, it's a warning, and it's a story they never, ever wanted you to hear. In the Libyan desert, a boy is born inside a Bedouin tent. His name is Muammar Gaddafi. There are no hospitals, no schools, no paved roads, absolutely no future. His father is an illiterate goat herder in one of the poorest corners of the planet. Libya at this time is a wasteland, ravaged by decades of brutal Italian colonization and the devastation of World War II. Life expectancy is a mere 44 years. A staggering 90% of the population cannot read or write. This barefoot child in the sand, however, would gain access to one thing that would alter his destiny and the world: a basic education. The newly independent Libya of 1951 was a cruel joke. King Idris, installed by the British, was a compliant puppet. When vast oil reserves were discovered in 1959, it became a curse, not a blessing for the people. The wealth flowed directly to Western corporations and London banks, while Libyans starved. Foreign oil giants pocketed over 70% of the revenue. The country was sitting on an ocean of black gold, but its people were trapped in medieval poverty. A young Gaddafi, educated in military academies, witnessed this grand theft with burning clarity. He was furious. On September 1st, 1969, while King Idris was enjoying a health spa in Turkey, a 27-year-old Captain Gaddafi and his group of free officers led a swift, bloodless coup. Without firing a single shot, they seized control of the country. His message was simple, direct, and utterly electrifying to a downtrodden nation. Libya's wealth belongs to the Libyan people. His first actions were a direct declaration of war on the entire post-colonial world order. He immediately expelled the powerful British and American military bases that had operated on Libyan soil with impunity. He looked the giant Western oil corporations in the eye and demanded a 50% share of the revenue. When they balked, he demanded 70%. Then, he simply nationalized the entire industry. The oil was now Libya's, period. The executive boards in London and Houston were enraged. The governments in Washington and Whitehall were stunned. A 27-year-old from a desert tent had just redrawn the map of global resource power, declaring absolute economic independence. This was not just a revolution, it was a direct challenge. And it was only the beginning. With the oil now flowing for Libyans, not for London or Washington, the transformation begins, and it is staggering. Between the 1972 and the 2000s, Libya experiences the most dramatic surge in human development ever recorded on the African continent. The numbers are not just statistics, they are a revolution in human dignity. The illiteracy rate, a crippling 90% when Gaddafi took power, plummets to under 10%. Life expectancy, once a grim 44 years, leaps to 74 years, rivaling many European nations. GDP per capita explodes, becoming the absolute highest in all of Africa. The black gold that once enriched foreign corporations was now building a nation from the sand up, creating a potential model for the entire continent. But what did this mean for the average Libyan? It meant life became unrecognizable. Education wasn't just free, it was a right, from primary school all the way through university. If a Libyan wanted to study a subject not available in the country, the government paid for them to go abroad, tuition, accommodation, and a living stipend included. Healthcare wasn't just available, it was universal and free. Electricity was so heavily subsidized it was nearly free. A newly married couple received a $50,000 grant from the state to buy their first home. Fuel costs less than bottled water. This wasn't just policy, it was a direct redistribution of the nation's wealth to its citizens, an experiment in social welfare on a scale Africa had never seen. And then there was the project that symbolized Libya's defiant independence, the Great Man-Made River. Started in 1983, it was the largest irrigation project in human history, a network of pipes stretching 4,000 kilometers, pulling fossil water from deep beneath the Sahara to turn the desert green and provide fresh water to coastal cities. The cost? Over $25 billion. The financing? 100% Libyan. No loans from the World Bank. No crippling debt from the IMF. Gaddafi called it the eighth wonder of the world, and it was a monumental symbol of self-sufficiency. It proved that an African nation could achieve incredible feats of engineering and development without Western financial control. An independent, self-funding, prosperous Africa was a dangerous idea, and Libya was its proof of concept. But here is the paradox that complicates the story, the uncomfortable truth within this newfound prosperity. While Gaddafi was building a welfare state, he was also building a fortress of absolute power. He was not a benevolent democrat. He was a megalomaniac with a messianic vision of himself. Dissent was not tolerated, it was crushed. Political opponents vanished into prisons like Abu Salim. State-controlled television broadcast public executions to instill fear. His Green Book, a strange mix of socialist and Islamist philosophy, became mandatory reading, replacing political discourse. The message was clear. Libya belonged to the people, but the people belonged to Gaddafi. The architect of Africa's greatest success story was also forging a brutal dictatorship, a contradiction that would define his rule and ultimately seal his fate. But Gaddafi's ambitions didn't stop at Libya's borders. His vision was continental. While the West focused on his brutality at home, they ignored the far more dangerous revolution he was planning abroad. He wasn't just building a nation. He was attempting to liberate a continent from centuries of economic servitude. He became a fervent champion of Pan-Africanism, pushing for a United States of Africa, a powerful, self-reliant bloc that could stand on its own feet. And he was willing to finance it himself. This is where the story turns, where a regional dictator becomes an existential threat to the global financial order. Gaddafi proposed his most audacious plan, a move that would seal his death warrant more surely than any political execution. He proposed the creation of a single African currency, the gold-backed dinar. Think about what that means. A currency backed by solid gold, used by African nations to trade their oil, their minerals, their vast natural resources, completely bypassing the US dollar and the euro. For the Western financial system, which is built on the petrodollar, the global agreement that oil must be traded in US dollars, this was not just a challenge, it was a declaration of war. An Africa trading without the dollar is an Africa free from American financial control. But a currency needs institutions. Gaddafi knew this. He laid out a plan to create 3 financial pillars for the continent, all funded by Libya's $150 billion sovereign wealth fund money accumulated from oil profits and parked in Western banks. First, an African central bank based in Nigeria. Second, an African monetary fund based in Cameroon, which would make the IMF's debt trap loans obsolete. Third, an African investment bank based in Libya to finance African development without needing the World Bank. Do you understand the implications? An Africa free of debt to the IMF, an Africa whose infrastructure is built by African money, an Africa whose currency is stable and backed by gold, while Western currencies were being printed into oblivion. This was the ultimate nightmare for the global banking elite. But how do you attack a man for trying to make his continent prosperous? You don't. You paint him as a monster. And Gaddafi, in his arrogance, gave them the ammunition they needed. He saw himself as a global revolutionary, financing any group that claimed to fight Western imperialism. The IRA in Ireland, ETA in Spain, the Black Panthers in the United States, revolutionary movements across Latin America. Gaddafi's money and weapons found their way to all of them. For him, they were freedom fighters. For the West, they were terrorists. And Gaddafi was their chief sponsor. The label was perfect. It was simple, terrifying, and it completely obscured the real economic threat he posed. The first strike came not in 2011, but decades earlier. Ronald Reagan had enough. In 1986, he greenlit Operation El Dorado Canyon. F-111 bombers took off from bases in the UK and flew across Europe to bomb Tripoli and Benghazi. The stated objective: assassinating Gaddafi in retaliation for a nightclub bombing in Berlin. The attack missed Gaddafi, but it killed 60 civilians, including his 5-month-old adopted daughter, Hannah. The message was crystal clear: you are a target. Step back. Know your place. But Gaddafi didn't learn. He survived, more defiant than ever, convinced that his only path to security was to break the system that was trying to kill him. He had crossed a line not with guns but with gold, and the powers that be would never, ever forgive him for it. The Arab Spring begins in Tunisia, then Egypt. When protests erupt in Benghazi, Libya, some demonstrators are armed, attacking police stations. Gaddafi responds with the brutal, inflammatory rhetoric of a cornered dictator. We will cleanse Libya house by house. We will find you in your closets. Western media has its soundbite. The narrative is set in stone overnight. A genocidal madman is slaughtering his own innocent people. They speak of mass bombings of civilians and impending massacres of 10,000 inches Benghazi. Years later, independent investigations, including one by the British Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, would find no evidence for these claims, concluding the threat to civilians was massively overstated. But in March 2011, the truth didn't matter. The story was too good to check. The hypocrisy is staggering. This was the same Gaddafi who, just a few years earlier, was praised for his statesmanship. In 2003, he voluntarily dismantled his entire weapons of mass destruction program. In return, he was promised security, a new beginning. British Prime Minister Tony Blair flew to Tripoli in 2004 to shake his hand. U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice visited in 2008, hailing a new chapter in relations. Sanctions were lifted. Oil companies rushed back in. So, what changed? Did Gaddafi suddenly become more brutal than the other Western-backed dictators in the region? No, his ambition became more dangerous to the established order. The real crime wasn't his human rights record. It was his plan for African economic independence. Let's be clear about the true motives, the ones not mentioned on the evening news. The intervention wasn't about protecting people, it was about protecting the system. It was about neutralizing the gold dinar, a currency that threatened to dethrone the US dollar and the euro in African resource trading. It was about destroying the plan for an African central bank and monetary fund that would break the continent's dependency on the IMF and World Bank. It was about gaining unfettered access to Africa's largest oil reserves without a nationalist leader demanding a fair price. It was about preventing the rise of a unified, economically sovereign African bloc. This was an economic execution, masked as a humanitarian intervention. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing a no-fly zone over Libya for the stated purpose of protecting civilians. Russia and China abstained, trusting it would be a limited action. They were deceived. Within 48 hours, French jets began bombing Libyan forces. The no-fly zone immediately became a full-scale, NATO-led campaign for regime change. Over 7 months, NATO flew over 26,000 sorties, systematically dismantling Libya's military and government infrastructure. They weren't just enforcing a flight ban, they were acting as the Air Force for one side of a civil war, blatantly violating the UN mandate they claimed to uphold. The objective was clear from day one. Gaddafi had to be destroyed. But the real tragedy wasn't just the death of one man, it was the death of Libya itself. The liberation promised was a lie. Let's look at the balance sheet. Before 2011, zero foreign debt, the highest GDP per capita in Africa, free university education, free health care, and vast sovereign wealth. After 2011, a nation in ruins. The state didn't just weaken, it evaporated. The power vacuum left by Gaddafi wasn't filled by democracy, but by chaos. A hydra of warring militias, jihadist groups, and rival governments sprouted from the rubble, each carving out its own brutal fiefdom. The country was split between two, sometimes three, competing administrations, making a mockery of the very idea of a unified Libya. This anarchy was a perfect breeding ground for extremism. In a chilling twist of fate, ISIS established its largest stronghold outside of Iraq and Syria, right in Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte. They ruled with medieval brutality, conducting public executions in the city square. The very humanitarian intervention designed to prevent massacres had imported a new, more fanatical brand of terror. And then came the ultimate symbol of Libya's regression, a horror not seen on this scale for centuries: open-air slave markets. Investigations by international journalists captured footage of sub-Saharan African migrants being sold like cattle for as little as $400. $400 for a human life in the country that was once Africa's wealthiest. This wasn't a side effect, it was a return to a pre-modern darkness, enabled entirely by the collapse of the state. The devastation wasn't contained within Libya's borders. Gaddafi's massive armories were looted, flooding the entire Sahel region with advanced weaponry. From Mali to Nigeria, conflicts were ignited and intensified by Libyan guns, destabilizing a dozen nations. The country itself became a gaping wound on the Mediterranean coast. With no central authority to police its borders, Libya transformed into the primary launching point for a desperate exodus of refugees and migrants. Hundreds of thousands of people, fleeing the very chaos the intervention had created, packed into flimsy boats, turning the sea into a graveyard. The European migration crisis that dominated headlines for years has its epicenter here, in the ashes of a deliberately destroyed nation. This wasn't a mission that went wrong. It was the predictable, catastrophic outcome of shattering a stable, if authoritarian, state for geopolitical gain, leaving behind a wasteland of death, despair, and slavery. This was the true price of protection. So what is the truth? The one deliberately buried under the rubble of Tripoli. Muammar Gaddafi was a brutal dictator. That is undeniable. He tortured opponents, executed dissidents, and committed horrific crimes against his own people. But that is not why he was destroyed. The world is full of brutal dictators who die peacefully in their beds, backed by the very same powers that bombed Libya into the Stone Age. The difference? Gaddafi committed the one unforgivable sin. He tried to achieve real economic independence. He didn't just want to rule Libya, he wanted to liberate a continent. His ambition for a gold-backed African dinar, for African financial institutions free from the chains of the IMF and the World Bank, was an existential threat to the global financial architecture. That was his death sentence. The narrative of humanitarian intervention was a masterfully crafted lie, a public relations campaign to mask a brutal resource grab and the assassination of a dangerous idea. They didn't bomb Libya to save civilians. They bombed it to save the petrodollar, to maintain control over Africa's resources, and to crush the dream of a unified, sovereign Africa before it could ever take root. This is a pattern repeated throughout history. Leaders from resource-rich nations who dare to pursue genuine self-determination, who try to use their wealth for their own people, often meet a violent end. Gaddafi wasn't an exception. He was the latest example of a rule enforced with cruise missiles. The message was clear. You can be a tyrant, but you cannot challenge the system. So, what is the final truth? The story of Libya is not merely a tragedy, it is a blueprint. It demonstrates how a nation can be systematically dismantled under the guise of humanitarianism. We've seen how Africa's most developed country, a model of self-sufficiency, was deliberately plunged into anarchy, becoming a failed state with open slave markets, all in a matter of months. This destruction was not an unforeseen consequence, it was the objective. Gaddafi's authoritarianism, while real and brutal, was a convenient pretext. His true crime was challenging the global financial order, threatening the supremacy of the petrodollar, and forging a path toward genuine African economic independence. This is the uncomfortable reality behind the headlines. So, the next time you are told that military intervention is for the protection of civilians, you must question it. Ask who stands to gain financially. Scrutinize why one dictator is targeted while others are armed and supported. Recognize the patterns of resource control and geopolitical power that drive these decisions. Because these hidden histories are not just academic exercises, they are vital lessons in how the world truly operates. Understanding them is our only defense against being misled into sanctioning the next demolition of a sovereign nation for reasons we are never told.